Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow, as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften, like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. Some fears don't come from things standing still, but from the feeling that everything is moving too fast. Like water rising quietly, no noise, no warning, until you suddenly realize you've been trying to swim against the current. Marcus left work after it was fully dark. He drove his familiar delivery truck into the automatic car wash near his place, where bright white lights reflected off wet metal. That night, he wasn't in a hurry. Not because he had extra time, but because his body felt tired in a way that was hard to name, tired from gripping the steering wheel for too long. Marcus was 41, a delivery driver, used to packed schedules, used to being on time, en route, on rhythm. But tonight, as the truck rolled to the start of the wash track, he let his hands drop from the wheel and allowed the vehicle to move forward on its own. A very small thing, very ordinary, and somehow unfamiliar. The doors closed. Water began to pour over the windshield, loud at first, then settling into a steady rush. The sound of the water covered everything else, blurring the outside world. Marcus sat still, watching droplets race across the glass, merging and separating, never moving in straight lines. Inside the cab, everything felt quieter. No radio, no alerts. Just the sound of water and the gentle vibration as the conveyor pulled the truck along. Marcus noticed he was holding his breath, an old habit whenever he waited for something uncertain. He breathed out, letting his chest fall, then breathed in again slower. A memory surfaced of swimming in a river when he was a kid. The adults had warned him, if the current is strong, don't fight it. Let your body float. Let the water carry you toward a safer edge. Back then, Marcus didn't understand. Swimming against it felt like trying. Letting go sounded like giving up. But later, he learned that in fast-moving water, struggling in the wrong direction is what puts you in danger. The water kept pouring down. Soft brushes spun and brushed against the sides of the truck, then moved on. Marcus noticed his hands resting on his thighs. His fingers were slightly curled as if ready to grip again at any moment. He opened his hand just a little, not letting go completely, just easing the tension. Marcus's fear didn't have a clear shape. It wasn't one specific event. It was the sense that if he stopped controlling things for even a second, everything would slip off course. That if he didn't stay tight, didn't keep holding it together, life would carry him somewhere he hadn't planned to go. But right now, in a vehicle that wasn't steering yet, was still moving, Marcus noticed something else. The truck didn't need him to guide it through the wash. The conveyor knew its job. The water knew its path, and he only needed to sit. A stronger wave of water swept across the windshield, turning the outside into shifting light and shadow. Marcus didn't try to see through it. He let his eyes rest. A small sensation appeared, not full relief, just a little less strain. Like the moment you stop fighting the current and realize you're not sinking right away. He thought about the past few months. All the effort to keep things organized, the pressure of keeping everyone else steady. The nights he came home with his shoulders still tight. Maybe life hadn't been too harsh. Maybe he'd just been swimming upstream for too long. The water began to soften. The final droplets fell more slowly. The conveyor kept moving the truck forward, steady and patient. Marcus realized his breathing had deepened without him noticing. Not the kind of deep breath you forced to relax, just a breath that wasn't being held anymore. The truck was almost out of the wash. The lights ahead became clearer. Marcus placed his hands back on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar surface. This time he didn't grip it. He just rested his hands there, ready to guide when needed. Maybe letting go isn't about allowing the water to pull you under. Maybe it's about knowing when to swim and when to let the water hold you up. And tonight, in this brief moment, Marcus was being held. The truck rolled out of the car wash and paused briefly before the conveyor released Marcus back onto the road. He stayed seated for a few seconds, not because there was something to do, but because his body wasn't ready to rush. The windshield was still dotted with water, turning the streetlights into soft, blurred halos. The world outside wasn't sharp, and this time he didn't try to make it clearer. Marcus turned on the wipers, a slow rhythm. Each pass cleared part of the glass, then the view softened again as new droplets settled. There was no moment of perfect clarity, but there was no moment of total blindness either. He noticed he didn't need to choose between the two. He pulled onto the road, driving more slowly than usual. Not because he was tired, but because there was no reason to push himself forward. The traffic light ahead shifted from green to yellow, then red. Marcus stopped, planted both feet firmly on the floor. His hands stayed on the wheel, but the pressure was different. There was no urge to grip. Something became clearer to him. Swimming against the current doesn't just exhaust the body, it blurs your sense of direction. When all your energy goes into resistance, you stop hearing the signals of the water. You only hear your heartbeat and your rushed breathing. And in that state, it's hard to tell where the shore is. Marcus watched the thin line of cars ahead. The city at night wasn't as loud as it was during the day. It moved more slowly with its own rhythm. He noticed small details he usually overlooked. Light spilling onto tree branches, a closed storefront, a sign gently swaying in the breeze. Things that were there every night, but only appeared when he stopped rushing. Fear hadn't disappeared. It didn't need to. It just wasn't driving anymore. It sat somewhere else in the truck, quieter, no longer giving commands. Marcus realized he could live alongside this uncertainty, as long as he didn't try to shove it away or pull it too close. He remembered that moment in the river years ago when he stopped fighting the current and let the water lift him. It hadn't felt completely safe. But it was the first moment he wasn't exhausted. And only when he wasn't exhausted could he see where to go. The truck turned into his familiar neighborhood. The roads narrowed. The streetlights softened to yellow. Marcus slowed down, as if naturally matching the pace of the space around him. He parked in front of his house, turned off the engine, and stayed seated. An old habit would have told him to get out right away and finish whatever was next. But tonight, there was no list waiting. He rested his head against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. Not long. Just long enough to feel his body being held by the seat, by the ground beneath, by the simple fact that right now, he was safe. Inhale. Exhale. No counting, no goal. Marcus opened his eyes and stepped out of the truck. The night air was cool. He closed the door gently. Every movement was a little slower, not on purpose, but because he was no longer being pulled by hurried thoughts. Maybe tomorrow the current would be strong again. Work responsibility and the things he couldn't control would return. But tonight he remembered something important: you don't always have to swim. Sometimes the wisest choice is to float and trust the water to carry you through. Marcus went inside. Fewer lights on, the space quiet. He didn't carry the feeling of bracing himself anymore. Only a soft looseness in his shoulders and back, a sign that he'd stopped pushing. The night didn't ask him to fight the current. It simply invited him to rest and let the flow do the rest. Fog doesn't arrive all at once. It spreads, very slowly. So slowly that if you're not paying attention, you only notice it once. Everything ahead feels a little less clear than before. Ava returned to her hotel room close to midnight. The long flight and the time change had left her body tired in a strange way. Not quite sleepy, not fully awake either. The hotel room felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Soft yellow light, curtains drawn. She set her small suitcase against the wall, took off her shoes, and sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Ava was 29, a flight attendant used to flight maps, clear routes, destinations decided ahead of time. But when she wasn't in the air, when there was no schedule right in front of her, her life felt like it was moving through fog. No obvious wrong decision, just intersections that weren't bright enough yet to name. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a background sound like distant waves. Ava stood and pulled the curtain open slightly. Outside, the city blurred under the night lights. Streets weren't clearly visible, just patches of light melting into each other. She thought about the questions that had followed her for months. How much longer will I stay in this job? What do I want when my schedule isn't full anymore? If I stop, where would I go? The questions weren't urgent, but they lingered. Like fog, not blocking the road, just softening the view. Ava let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the bed. She turned on the bedside lamp, creating a small circle of light. Inside that circle, things were clear. Outside of it, nothing needed to be seen. She picked up the glass on the table and poured water from the pitcher. The sound of the water was gentle and steady. She took a small sip, then set the glass down. No rush, no schedule she had to follow right now. There was an image that had come to her many times, a small boat drifting through thick fog. The person steering couldn't see the far shore, couldn't see the whole river, only a few feet of water ahead of the bow. And strangely, the boat could still move forward. Not fast, not with total certainty, but enough to avoid running aground. Ava realized she had been trying to see farther than she needed to. She wanted the entire path visible before allowing herself to move. But fog doesn't work that way. It doesn't lift because you strain your eyes. It thins only as you move forward a little at a time. She lay back on the bed without pulling the blanket up yet. Just lay there, letting the mattress support her back. The air conditioner continued its steady rhythm, a background breath she didn't need to control. The quiet was wide enough for her thoughts to slow. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The bedside lamp looked the same. No new information, no clear answers appearing. But there was no danger in front of her either. Just the night, the room, and a body that needed rest. She thought about flights that take off in fog. Pilots don't wait for the sky to become completely clear. They rely on the nearest instruments, the signals right in front of the aircraft. And once the plane rises, the fog stays below. Ava pulled the blanket up and placed a hand on her belly. Her breath rose and fell. Not deeper, not slower, just steady. She realized she didn't need to decide anything tonight. No need to map out the next year, just stay with the short stretch of path she could see. Outside, the city kept moving in the fog. Inside, the hotel room held its own quiet rhythm. Ava let her eyelids grow heavy, not because everything was clear, but because it didn't need to be any clearer right now. Maybe moving through fog isn't being lost. Maybe it's just the road asking us to slow down. The night in the hotel room moved more slowly than Ava expected, not because time had stretched, but because there was nothing left pushing her to keep up. The light from the bedside lamp softened in her vision as her eyelids grew heavier. The air conditioner continued its steady hum, an unchanging background sound, like a breath the room was holding for her. Ava rolled onto her side. The pillow supported her neck in a familiar way. She didn't try to find the perfect position. She simply lay in a way that asked nothing more from her body. In that just right darkness, thoughts still drifted by, but they no longer crowded the front of her mind. They stayed farther back, blurrier, like the city lights outside softened by fog. She thought again of the boat in the fog. Not a large boat, not a long journey, just a small one moving slowly, steady enough not to tip. The person steering didn't need a detailed map, didn't need to see the far shore. only needed to know which direction the bow was facing and that the water ahead was still deep enough to move through. Ava realized how often she exhausted herself by trying to see farther than the night allowed. During the day, that kind of looking ahead could be useful. But at night, seeing too far often turned into worry. It pulled the future closer than it needed to be, making things that hadn't arrived yet feel as heavy as if they already had. She took in a very gentle breath, then let it out. Not to calm anything, just letting her breath find its own rhythm. There are movements in the body that don't need willpower. When left alone, they know how to return to balance. Outside the window, the city was still there, even if Ava couldn't see it clearly. The roads were still open. The intersections still existed. Not seeing them right now didn't erase them. It simply meant they weren't needed in this moment. Ava remembered the feeling of sitting in the cockpit as a plane prepared to take off in fog. Not everything appeared at once, only the nearest signals, a runway, a few instruments, and the trust that as the plane moved forward, visibility would open up at the right time. She rested a hand on the blanket and felt its familiar warmth. Her hand relaxed, fingers loose. No need to hold on to any decision. Just knowing she was here safe in this room, in this moment. There are phases in life that don't ask us to know where we're going. They only ask us to keep moving slowly enough not to panic. And some nights, continuing simply means allowing ourselves to rest. Ava stopped trying to arrange the future in her mind. She didn't ask what would come next. She didn't force herself to feel calm. She let the night do its work, softening what didn't need to be seen yet, so the rest could rest. Her breathing became more even, not deep, not shallow, just even. With each exhale, her body felt a little heavier, as if being set down piece by piece. If the fog remained tomorrow, she would meet tomorrow then. If the road still wasn't clear, she would follow what she could see. No rush, no need for perfect certainty, just enough. In the quiet hotel room, Ava let her eyes close fully. The bedside lamp was now only a faint glow behind her eyelids. There was nothing to complete before sleep, nothing to decide. The boat continued to drift. No need to see the distant shore, only the water ahead still carrying it forward, and the night with all its softness and blur was doing that very well. Winter doesn't always arrive with snow. Sometimes it comes as cold wind slipping through your collar, as gray skies that linger for days, as the quiet sense that everything has slowed down without any announcement. Holly stood at the bus stop, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. It was already dark earlier than in other seasons. Streetlights flickered on their pale yellow glow, reflecting off the damp pavement. The wind wasn't strong, but it was enough to let the cold creep into every small opening. Holly was 33, a nursing assistant used to taking care of others. Her shift had ended late, her body tired, her mind empty in that specific way that comes from giving too much of yourself in one day. She stood still, not stamping her feet for warmth, not checking her phone. Just standing there, letting time pass in the cold. The bus stop was quiet. A few people stood spaced apart just far enough. No one spoke. Only the wind and the distant sound of passing cars. Holly breathed out. A thin cloud of vapor appeared, then disappeared almost instantly. She watched it, then let her eyes rest. Some seasons in life feel like a long winter. Not because something is wrong, but because nothing is growing. No clear progress. No sign that warmth is on its way. And what exhausts people most isn't the cold itself, but the fear that it might never end. Holly thought about the past few months. Shift after shift. Coming home after dark, waking up to gray mornings. She wasn't sad in a dramatic way, just quietly worn down like ground that's been frozen for too long. She wrapped her scarf tighter and pulled her sleeves down. A natural reflex. Protection. Warmth. In the cold, the body knows what to do, even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. The bus hadn't arrived. The digital sign blinked, showing a few more minutes. Holly didn't check it again. A few minutes or 10 wouldn't change anything. She stood there listening to her breathing, which grew steadier once she stopped trying to warm herself by constant movement. Someone walked past, leaving behind the faint smell of a damp coat. A car splashed through a puddle, sending up a few drops. The city kept living through its winter, without complaining, without apologizing. Holly remembered past winters. Some had been long, some had felt endless. And yet somehow, they had passed. Not in a single day. Not with a dramatic sign. Just one morning when the light felt slightly different. The wind less sharp. And she realized she'd made it through the coldest part. She slipped a hand into her coat pocket and touched her knitted gloves. She didn't put them on yet. Just touched them. The softness eased the numbness in her fingers a little. A very small warmth, but real. There are fears that whisper, what if it stays like this forever? What if I've gone too far into winter? But winter doesn't ask for answers. It only asks to be walked through one day at a time. Holly looked up at the sky. No stars. Just a deep gray stretch. She didn't search for signs of spring in this night. She didn't need to. Night isn't meant to promise anything. It only needs to be quiet enough to stand within. The bus appeared at the end of the street, its white headlights cutting through the dark. It arrived neither sooner nor later than expected. It arrived when it arrived. Holly stepped on, tapped her card, and found a seat near the window. The seat was cold at first, then slowly warmed. She leaned her head against the glass. Her breath fogged a small patch. Outside, the scenery moved past, slowly blurred. Holly didn't try to see it clearly. She didn't need to know exactly where she was passing. Only that she was moving. There's something strange about winter, even when everything looks still. Something is always flowing underneath, like roots beneath frozen soil, like water moving under ice, unseen but never stopped. Holly closed her eyes, not to sleep, just to stop meeting the cold with her gaze. As the bus warmed, her body loosened slightly. Maybe this winter wasn't over yet. Maybe it would last a while longer. But that didn't mean it was all there would ever be. The bus moved on at a steady pace, the low hum of the engine like a large heartbeat, keeping the space from falling too quiet. Holly leaned against the window. Her breath fogged the glass once more, then slowly faded. She didn't wipe it away. She let the mark disappear on its own, the way many things in life do when they aren't held on to. Outside streetlights passed one by one. Light brushed her face, then slid away, never staying long. Holly didn't count them, didn't track them. She let her eyes rest, letting her body be carried without having to stay alert. As the bus warmed, her shoulders dropped, not because she decided to relax, but because the cold that had made her hold herself tight at the stop was no longer pressing in the same way. Some kinds of letting go happen naturally when the conditions change. Holly thought of winter as a necessary pause. No one chooses it. No one schedules it. But when it comes, the body adapts, adding layers, slowing down, staying closer to warmth. Maybe the mind needs similar things. Not big solutions, just small adjustments that make it possible to get through. She remembered a morning from years ago when winter had just begun to turn into spring. There hadn't been dramatic melting, just a shift in light, windows that felt less cold to the touch. And she had known, without needing proof, that the hardest part was behind her. The bus turned onto a familiar street. Holly opened her eyes and looked out. Low houses, windows glowing. Somewhere someone was cooking dinner. Someone else was sitting quietly after a long day. Each home held its own rhythm, no need to match another. She slipped a hand into her pocket, touched her gloves again, then pulled them out and put them on. This time it wasn't because she was too cold. It was because she wanted the warmth more clearly. A small choice, but enough. The fear that winter might never end was no longer standing right in front of her. It hadn't disappeared, but it had stepped back. Winter might still be here, but it wasn't the whole picture. The bus stopped. Holly stood and stepped down. The air outside was colder than inside the bus, but it didn't shock her the way it had earlier. Her body had adjusted. She pulled her scarf up and walked slowly toward home. The porch light turned on as she approached. A small circle of light opened in the darkness. Holly paused for a moment, breathing in, then out. This breath wasn't rushed. It didn't need to be. Some seasons don't ask us to be strong. They only ask us to keep going, to stay warm enough, not to go numb, and to trust that the light will change when it's time. Holly opened the door and stepped inside. The space was warmer, quieter. She took off her coat, hung it up, set her bag down. Familiar movements, gentle ones, like a ritual of bringing her body back home. Outside, winter continued doing its work. But inside this small house, there was warmth enough to rest. And sometimes, one warm space is all it takes to make it through a season. Holly turned off a few lights and walked toward her bedroom. The night didn't ask her to see spring yet. It only asked her to rest so that when spring did arrive, she would still have the strength to notice it. Fear doesn't always show up as panic. Sometimes it shows up as distance, a mind that keeps leaning forward, imagining everything that could go wrong, everything that hasn't happened yet. Your body might be standing still, but your thoughts are already far ahead, scanning the future, like it's a cliff you're about to fall from. Tyler learned this slowly. He was 34, a park ranger in a mountain region where people often came looking for quiet, but didn't always know what to do with it once they found it. That night, He was alone in the small ranger cabin, the kind with thick wooden walls and a single window facing the dark slope of the mountain. The wind moved through the trees outside, low and steady, not loud enough to be dramatic, just present. Tyler wasn't afraid of the mountain itself. He'd hiked it in every season. He knew the trails, the loose rocks, the places where snow stayed longer than expected. What unsettled him wasn't the terrain, it was the stretch of unknown ahead of him. A transfer request he hadn't answered yet, a relationship that felt like it was quietly changing shape. A future that didn't look dangerous, but didn't look clear either. He sat at the small table, boots still on, jacket unzipped. His headlamp rested beside his hand. He picked it up, turned it on, and pointed it toward the floor. The beam cut a clean circle of light over the wooden boards. Everything beyond that circle stayed dark. Tyler noticed something he'd known for years, but had forgotten to apply to himself. When you're climbing in the dark, you don't look down the mountain. You don't look for the summit either. You look for the next place to put your foot. That's it. One step, then another. Fear has a way of convincing you to look everywhere except where you are. His thoughts kept pulling him forward. What if this choice closes the wrong door? What if I regret it? What if I don't see the danger coming? Each question widened the imagined drop in front of him. The future became a vast space with no edges, no markers, no handholds. Tyler exhaled slowly and brought the light back down to the floor. The wood grain, a scratch near the leg of the chair, dust that would need to be swept in the morning. Ordinary things, solid things. The kind of details that don't disappear when you're afraid. Outside, the wind shifted. A branch tapped lightly against the cabin wall, then went still again. The mountain wasn't rushing him. The night wasn't demanding answers. He remembered his first winter climb years ago, how his instructor had stopped him mid-trail when Tyler froze, staring down a steep slope. "Don't argue with the height," the man had said quietly. "Just place your foot." Back then, it hadn't felt like wisdom. It had felt like survival. Now, sitting alone in the cabin, Tyler understood it differently. Fear wasn't asking him to solve his life. It was just asking for attention. And attention didn't mean obedience. He stood up, took a few steps toward the door, then paused. His hand rested on the handle. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just needed to feel the weight of his body balanced upright here. There was something grounding about realizing that even if the path ahead changed, this step, this moment, was stable. The floor held him. The walls held the warmth. The night held everything else without explanation. Tyler turned off the headlamp and let the darkness return. It didn't feel threatening now. It felt wide, like a space that didn't need to be filled. Fear often imagines the worst possible version of tomorrow. But tomorrow never arrives all at once. It comes as moments, steps, small decisions made with the information you have, not the information you wish you had. Tyler sat back down. He unlaced his boots slowly, listening to the soft rasp of fabric and metal. When he finished, he lined them up by the door, neat but not perfect. He didn't check his phone. He didn't rehearse conversations that hadn't happened yet. He let the mountain be what it was, something large, something steady, something that didn't need him to conquer it tonight. Sometimes peace doesn't come from feeling brave. It comes from remembering that you're not required to see the whole path, only the ground beneath you. The wind outside softened. The cabin settled into its quiet creaks and pauses. Tyler leaned back in his chair and allowed his gaze to rest on nothing in particular. The next step could wait. For now, this one was enough. Later that night, the cabin grew quieter in a way Tyler could feel rather than hear. The wind didn't stop, it just became part of the background, like a low breath moving through the trees. The kind of sound you don't need to follow. The kind that keeps going whether you pay attention or not. Tyler lay back on the narrow bed near the wall. He didn't turn off the small lamp right away. Its light was soft, barely reaching the corners of the room, leaving most things in shadow. The ceiling above him was simple wood. Nothing to figure out, nothing to interpret. His mind tried once or twice to wander ahead again, to the transfer request, to the future version of himself that might look back and judge this moment. But the thoughts didn't have the same grip. They arrived without urgency, then drifted off when nothing responded. He brought his attention to his body instead. The way the mattress supported his weight, the way his shoulders sank slightly once he stopped holding them up, the quiet rhythm of his breath already slower than before. In the mountains, Tyler knew panic often came from looking too far. People slipped not because the ground disappeared, but because their attention did. They leaned forward before their footing was secure. Fear works the same way in the mind. Tyler let that idea pass without holding on to it. He didn't need to turn it into ideas. He'd learned enough to know that understanding something didn't always mean doing something with it. Outside, a distant animal call echoed once, then faded. It didn't trigger alarm. It was just another reminder that the night had its own movements, its own language. One that didn't ask for interpretation. Tyler reached over and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but not completely. There was still a thin outline of the window, a faint suggestion of trees beyond it. Enough to orient himself, enough to feel safe. He remembered how on night climbs, experienced climbers trusted their lights not to show the whole route, but to show enough. Enough rock, enough ground, enough information to take the next step without guessing. That was all the light was ever meant to do. Fear often demands certainty. It wants guarantees, full maps, complete explanations. But the body doesn't need all that to rest. The body only needs to know that right now, it's not falling. Tyler placed one hand on his chest, the other resting loosely at his side. His fingers were relaxed, not curled into fists. His breath moved in and out without effort, without correction. The mountain didn't ask him to decide anything tonight. The future didn't ask him to arrive early. There was a quiet relief in realizing that uncertainty wasn't a threat. It was simply space. Space where things hadn't formed yet. Space that didn't need to be filled with fear. Tyler's thoughts grew less specific. They lost their sharp edges, becoming more like impressions than sentences. The idea of tomorrow softened. The need to resolve anything faded into the background. He didn't tell himself to sleep. He didn't tell himself to relax. He just stayed with the steady feeling of being held by the bed. stayed with the sound of wind passing through branches, stayed with the simple fact of being here now, without needing to move. At some point, the distinction between listening and drifting began to blur. His awareness widened, then thinned like a beam of light slowly dimming. The path ahead would still be there in the morning. The choices would still wait. For now there was no cliff, only solid ground beneath him, only one step already taken, and that was enough to let the night carry the rest. The leaf had been there longer than Susan expected. It clung to the bare branch outside her window long after the others had let go. Day after day, the tree stood almost empty, its limbs thin against the sky, while that one leaf remained brown at the edges, curled inward, still attached. Susan noticed it one quiet afternoon when she sat by the window with a book she wasn't really reading. The light was soft, the kind that only comes late in the season. Not warm, not cold, just tired. She was 62 now, a librarian for most of her life. Someone who had learned to love slow things, pages turning shelves, settling the low hum of a building holding its breath. Change had never frightened her loudly. It arrived for her in subtler ways. Retirements, empty desks, names that stopped appearing on holiday cards. The leaf didn't move much. Even when the wind came through it, only trembled slightly, as if unsure whether it was ready. Susan found herself watching it longer than she meant to, wondering what kept it there. She told herself it was just biology. A stronger stem, a sheltered angle. Nothing poetic about it. And yet, she kept looking. Later that evening, she stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. Somewhere nearby, crickets began their steady rhythm, not loud, not shy. The tree stood just a few steps from the porch railing. Up close, the leaf looked thinner than she'd imagined. Fragile, almost translucent where the light passed through. Susan reached out not to touch it, but to steady herself against the railing. She remembered autumns from years ago when her husband would rake leaves into uneven piles and complain about how they never stayed where he put them. She smiled faintly at the memory, then felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when a thought didn't have anywhere to land. Loss didn't always arrive as a sharp event. Sometimes it lingered like this leaf refusing to fall when everything else already had. Susan had learned to live alongside that kind of absence. The quiet seat at the table. The extra mug she no longer needed. The way evenings stretched longer now. She didn't push the feeling away. She let it rest the same way she let the night settle around her. The leaf rustled once, then stilled again. There was something oddly comforting about it. Not the holding on, but the patience. The leaf wasn't fighting gravity. It wasn't resisting change with effort. It was simply still there for now. Susan thought about all the endings she had feared when she was younger. The ones she imagined would break her. The ones she thought she wouldn't survive. Most of them hadn't come the way she expected. And when they did come, they didn't erase her. They rearranged her life quietly, slowly, until she learned how to stand in the new shape. She sat down on the porch chair, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The sound felt familiar, grounding. She watched her breath fog faintly in the cooler air, then disappear. Impermanence, she knew, wasn't a threat. It was a rhythm. Everything entered, everything left. Even the things that stayed longer than expected eventually followed the same pattern. Still knowing something and feeling ready for it were different things. Susan closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the crickets, the distant sound of a car passing somewhere far away. The night didn't hurry the leaf. It didn't insist on anything. When she opened her eyes again, the leaf was still there. She smiled at that, not because she needed it to stay forever, but because it was allowed to stay as long as it did. Some endings don't need to be forced. Some beginnings don't announce themselves. Sometimes life simply waits until everything is ready. Susan leaned back, letting the chair support her, letting the quiet do its work. The leaf would fall when it fell, or it wouldn't. Either way, the tree already knew how to grow again. The leaf stayed through the night. Susan noticed it again in the morning light, still holding on, still quiet. Frost traced a thin line along the railing, and the air carried that clean, almost metallic chill that came just before winter settled in. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt unfinished. She made her tea and stood by the window while it steeped, watching the branch sway gently. The leaf moved with it, now less rigid than before, as if it had loosened its grip without letting go entirely. Susan didn't wonder when it would fall anymore. The question had softened into something less sharp. She was more curious about how it stayed present in this in-between moment, not fully alive, not yet gone. That space felt familiar. So much of her life now existed there, between who she had been and who she was becoming. Between the roles she once filled and the quieter ones she was learning to accept. Between holding and releasing. She carried her tea out to the porch again, the mug warming her hands. The chair creaked in the same place as the night before. The sound reassured her that some things at least were consistent. The leaf trembled once in a breeze that barely deserved the name. It turned slightly, catching the light. For a second, its veins glowed faintly, like a map no one needed to read anymore. Susan felt no urgency rise in her chest. No need to intervene. No need to wish for anything to happen faster. Loss had taught her that endings didn't require her permission. They arrived when they arrived. And beginnings, she had learned, were often too quiet to notice at first. She thought of the library she would leave behind in a few months, the shelves that would still hold their weight, the readers who would come and go without knowing her name. It no longer felt like erasure. It felt like continuity. The leaf shifted again. Then, without ceremony, it let go. There was no sound when it fell, no dramatic motion. It drifted downward in a slow, uneven path, turning once then again before resting on the ground beneath the tree. Susan watched without flinching. Something inside her loosened, not in grief, but in recognition. This was how it happened. This was how it always happened. Not with force, but with timing. She stayed where she was, breathing evenly, allowing the moment to complete itself without adding a story to it. The tree stood bare now, unremarkable, ready for its next quiet season. In a few months, new leaves would appear without asking whether the old ones had been missed. Susan finished her tea. The warmth spread through her chest, steady and kind. She set the mug down and rested her hands in her lap, palms open, fingers relaxed. Change, she realized, didn't mean disappearance. It meant movement. It meant making room. The fallen leaf would return to the earth. The tree would use what remained. Nothing was wasted. She stood up and went back inside, leaving the porch as it was. The day would unfold on its own. There was nothing she needed to carry forward from the night before. Impermanence wasn't a loss of ground. It was the ground itself, always shifting, always supporting the next step. And as the morning light grew a little brighter, Susan felt ready to move with it slowly, without fear, trusting the quiet intelligence of change. The light turned slowly, whether anyone was watching or not. From the edge of the station grounds, Noah could see it sweep across the dark water, pause for a fraction of a second, then move on again. The rhythm never changed. It didn't hurry. It didn't hesitate. It simply did what it had always done. Noah was 33, a firefighter used to alarms and urgency, and the kind of situations where standing still meant something had gone wrong. But tonight there were no calls coming in. The station was quiet in that rare, held-breath way that only happened late at night. He sat on the lower bunk, boots lying neatly on the floor, turnout jacket folded over the back of a chair. His wedding ring rested between his fingers. He turned it once, then again, a habit he'd picked up without noticing. Outside, the lighthouse kept its slow rotation. Noah hadn't planned to think about anything heavy tonight. He hadn't planned to think at all. But stillness had a way of making space, and space had a way of letting things drift in. Earlier that week, he'd stood in a hospital hallway, waiting for news that hadn't arrived on schedule. He'd been trained to respond to emergencies, to move toward danger, to do something. Standing there, unable to act, had felt strangely harder than running into smoke. Fear didn't always feel like panic to him. Sometimes it felt like vigilance that couldn't switch off. A body that stayed ready even when there was nothing left to prepare for. The lighthouse beam slid across the water again, catching the surface just long enough to reveal movement waves rising, collapsing, rearranging themselves endlessly. The light didn't stop the waves. It didn't calm the water. It didn't control the storm systems far out at sea. It just stood. Noah leaned back against the wall and let his shoulders rest there. The building was solid, familiar. He could hear a faint hum from the generator, the quiet shuffle of someone moving in the hallway upstairs. Ordinary sounds. Reassuring ones. He remembered visiting this coastline years ago, long before he wore this uniform. He'd stood much closer to the lighthouse than close enough to feel the vibration of its machinery through the ground. Back then, he'd assumed the light existed to save ships, to guide them perfectly to shore. Now he knew better. The lighthouse didn't guide ships home. It didn't promise safety. It simply marked a point. Something steady to orient around when everything else was moving. Noah rolled the ring between his fingers and slipped it back onto his hand. The metal felt cool, then warm as it settled. He didn't think about the future in detail. He didn't replay worst-case scenarios. He'd done enough of that already. Instead, he let his eyes rest on the light as it moved again and again. Fear liked to whisper that he had to hold everything together, that if he relaxed his attention even briefly, something terrible would happen. That responsibility meant constant tension. But the lighthouse wasn't tense. It didn't brace itself against the wind. It didn't strain to shine brighter when the sea grew rough. It trusted its structure, its foundation. The simple truth that being present was enough. Noah felt his breathing slow as he watched. In through his nose, out through his mouth. He didn't regulate it. He didn't correct it. He just noticed it happening. There would be storms again. He knew that. There would be calls in the middle of the night, moments that demanded everything he had. But tonight wasn't one of them. Tonight asked for something different. It asked him to stop scanning the horizon for danger and let the dark be dark. To allow uncertainty to exist without filling it with fear. The lighthouse beam swept past once more, steady and patient. Noah closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. The light was still there. The water was still moving. Nothing had fallen apart in the moments he'd rested. Sometimes strength isn't about bracing yourself. Sometimes it's about staying where you are and letting the storm move around you. Noah stayed seated, grounded by the weight of his body, the quiet of the station, the dependable turn of the light. He didn't need to do anything else. Not yet. The night deepened without announcing itself. Noah noticed it not by the clock, but by the way the station settled into a heavier quiet. Footsteps upstairs faded. A door closed softly. Somewhere a kettle clicked off after boiling and was forgotten. The ordinary sounds of people winding down, trusting the building to hold the rest. Outside the lighthouse continued its slow turning. The beam crossed the water, disappeared, then returned again, unchanged. It didn't react to the dark. It didn't measure it. Noah lay back on his bunk, hands folded loosely on his stomach. The mattress was firm, practical, the kind designed to support a body that might need to move quickly. Tonight, it only needed to support stillness. His thoughts drifted toward the things he couldn't control. Health, timing, outcomes. The kind of things that didn't respond to training or effort. He noticed the familiar urge to prepare, to imagine scenarios, to brace for impact. Then he noticed something else. The lighthouse didn't brace. It didn't tense its structure when the wind picked up. It didn't adjust its pace based on the sea's mood. It stayed rooted not because it was resisting the storm, but because it was built for change. That difference mattered. Noah exhaled slowly. The ring on his finger caught a trace of light as the beam passed, then slipped back into shadow. He let his hand relax, fingers uncurling naturally. There was a quiet permission in realizing that vigilance wasn't the same as care. That being alert all the time didn't actually protect the people he loved. It only wore him down. Care could be steady without being tight. Outside, the water shifted again, waves reshaping themselves in the dark. The lighthouse didn't follow them. It didn't try to correct their movement. It simply offered a point of reference, something constant in a field of motion. Noah felt the same kind of reference point inside his body now. The weight of the mattress, the rhythm of his breath. the sense of being here now without needing to manage the next hour. He thought about the future less specifically. It lost its sharp edges, becoming more like a wide open space than a list of threats. Uncertainty didn't disappear. It just stopped feeling personal. The station hummed softly around him. Pipes shifted. The building breathed in its own way. All of it functioned without his supervision. Noah closed his eyes and let the darkness remain. It didn't feel empty. It felt full of movement he didn't need to track. The lighthouse beam passed again, unseen this time, but still there. He didn't need to see it to trust it. There was a kind of strength in that, in knowing that steadiness didn't require constant attention. That support didn't vanish just because you stopped watching it. Noah's breathing slowed further. His body softened against the mattress. The tension he carried as a second skin loosened layer by layer. Storms would come and go, waves would rise and fall. Some nights would ask more of him than others, but not this one. Tonight was allowed to be simple. The lighthouse would keep turning. The sea would keep moving, and he could rest inside that rhythm without holding it together. As sleep approached, Noah felt something settle, not certainty, but trust. Trust that being present was enough. Trust that he didn't need to shine brighter or stand taller to be useful. The light did not compete with the dark, it simply remained. And in that quiet, unwavering presence, Noah let himself be held by the night, knowing that when morning came, the world would still be there, changed perhaps, but steady enough to meet him. The yard didn't look the same after the storm. Derek noticed it the moment he stepped outside, coffee mug still warm in his hand. The grass was darker, pressed flat in places. Leaves were scattered where they didn't belong. And near the old tree by the fence, one of the larger branches lay broken on the ground, angled awkwardly as if it had tried to land gently and failed. He stood there longer than he needed to. Derek was 52, a mechanic who'd spent most of his life fixing things that broke in obvious ways. Engines made sense to him. If something failed, there was usually a cause you could point to, a part you could replace. Loss, on the other hand, didn't follow diagrams. The tree had been there longer than the house. Thick trunk, deep roots. It had survived storms before. That was why the broken branch unsettled him more than he expected. Not because the damage was severe, but because it proved that even sturdy things gave way sometimes. He took a sip of coffee and set the mug down on the porch rail. The air smelled clean, almost sharp, the way it always did after heavy rain. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's garage door opened and closed. Ordinary morning sounds. Life continuing without commentary. Derek walked closer to the tree. The branch was heavier than it looked, bark rough against his palm when he reached down to test it. He didn't lift it yet. He just felt the weight. The storm had come through fast the night before. Wind howling, rain slamming sideways against the windows. He'd woken once, heart beating a little faster than usual, then fallen back asleep before he could name the fear. In the morning, the house was fine. The power was on. Nothing dramatic. Just this. A broken branch didn't feel like a disaster. It felt like a message he hadn't asked for. Derek straightened and looked up at the tree. The break was clean in places, jagged in others. Pale wood showed through where the branch had snapped raw and exposed. Above it, the rest of the tree stood unchanged, leaves still clinging, branches still reaching. He'd lost people the same way. Not all at once, not the whole structure, just a part that had mattered more than he'd admitted. He hadn't talked much about it. That wasn't his style. You learned early in his line of work and in his family to keep moving. To deal with what was in front of you. To fix what you could and accept what you couldn't without spending too much time naming it. Still, some mornings the weight returned without warning. Like now. Derek bent down again and wrapped both hands around the branch. This time he lifted. It took effort. The muscles in his arms tightened. The branch shifted, then came free from the ground with a dull scrape. It felt strange carrying something that used to be alive. He dragged it a few feet away from the tree and set it down. The ground beneath was lighter, where it had been pressed, a faint outline marking its absence. For a moment he considered cutting it up right away, clearing the yard, restoring order. That was usually his instinct. Instead, he paused. The tree above him rustled slightly in a breeze that barely qualified as wind. The sound wasn't sad. It wasn't triumphant. It was just there. Derek noticed small buds along the remaining branches, tight and green. He hadn't seen them before. They'd been there the whole time, waiting for the season to do what seasons did. Something loosened in his chest. Loss had taught him to expect emptiness, to brace for the space where something used to be. But the tree wasn't empty. It was adjusting, redistributing weight, making room without asking permission. He picked up the branch again and carried it toward the side of the yard, where he kept a pile for yard waste. Each step felt deliberate, not heavy with meaning, just steady. As he set the branch down, he rested his hand on the rough bark one last time. The surface was cool, damp from the rain, solid. Breaking, he realized, wasn't the opposite of growth. Sometimes it was part of it, a redirection, a necessary release of what could no longer be held. Derek straightened and looked back at the tree. It stood quietly, incomplete but alive, rooted despite the damage. The yard would look different now. Not worse, just changed. He picked up his coffee mug and took another sip. It had cooled, but he didn't mind. Some things didn't need to be perfect to be enough. The morning continued, and so did he. Later that afternoon, the light shifted in a way Derek recognized, but couldn't have named if asked. The sun dipped just enough to soften the edges of everything it touched. The yard looked quieter now, less like a place that needed fixing and more like a place that could be left alone for a while. He returned outside with a pair of work gloves and a small saw, then stopped halfway down the steps. The broken branch rested where he'd left it, angled against the fence, no longer surprising. The tree stood above it, steady, casting a familiar patch of shade. Derek took off the gloves and set them on the railing. There was no rush. He leaned against the porch post and listened. A bird called from somewhere he couldn't see. Another answered. The sounds didn't fill the space. They gave it shape. He noticed how the yard held both what had fallen and what remained without tension, without judgment. Grief, he'd learned, didn't move in straight lines. It circled back. It showed up in ordinary moments, in the quiet after a storm, in the sight of something changed but still standing. Derek breathed out slowly and felt the weight in his chest ease, not disappear, just settle into a more manageable place. He didn't need to make sense of it. He didn't need to turn it into a lesson. He only needed to let it be present without pushing it away. He walked closer to the tree and looked again at the break. The exposed wood had begun to darken slightly as it dried. The tree was already doing what trees did, closing, protecting, adapting. No instruction required. On one of the remaining branches, a small cluster of leaves caught the light. They were newer than the others, a little brighter. Derek hadn't noticed them earlier, not because they weren't there, but because his attention had been elsewhere. Loss had a way of narrowing the field of view. He touched the trunk lightly, feeling the texture beneath his palm. The tree didn't respond, but it didn't need to. It was alive in its own quiet way, continuing without explanation. Derek stepped back and sat on the porch step, elbows resting on his knees. From here, the yard looked balanced again, not the same, but not broken either. The space left by the fallen branch didn't pull his eye the way it had that morning. It was simply part of the scene now. He thought about how often he'd tried to fill empty spaces too quickly. How uncomfortable he was with gaps, silence, pauses, endings, without immediate replacements. He'd learned to patch and repair and move on because that was what kept things running. But some spaces didn't need to be filled. Some needed to be left open long enough for something new to find its way in. The breeze picked up slightly, just enough to stir the leaves. The tree shifted, redistributing its weight with a subtle creak. Derek felt something similar happen inside him, a quiet adjustment, a rebalancing that didn't require effort. He stood up and walked over to the broken branch once more. This time he didn't lift it. He just looked at it as it was no longer part of the tree, not yet returned to the earth. In between, there was dignity in that, he thought. In acknowledging what had been, without needing to carry it forward unchanged. Derek left the branch where it was and went back inside. The house felt calm, grounded. He washed his mug, dried it, set it upside down on the counter. Small actions, familiar rhythms, the kind that didn't ask him to be anyone other than who he was right now. As evening approached, the light faded again and the yard settled into shadow. From the window, Derek could still see the outline of the tree solid against the dimming sky. The broken branch was less visible now, its shape blending into the dark. He felt no urgency to resolve anything before nightfall. The tree would grow again. The yard would change with the seasons, and he would continue shaped by what had been lost, but not defined by it. Sometimes the strongest things weren't the ones that never broke. They were the ones that learned how to keep growing after they did. Derek turned off the lights and let the house rest. Outside, the tree stood quietly, making room, branch by branch, for whatever came next. The first thing Chloe noticed wasn't the rainbow. It was the smell. That clean, washed smell that came after heavy rain. Wet pavement leaves a little bit of metal in the air. The kind of smell that made the city feel newly rinsed, like someone had turned the volume down on everything. Chloe stood under the bus stop shelter with her tote bag hooked around her wrist, watching water drip from the edge of the roof in steady little taps. The street in front of her shined under the streetlights, dark and reflective, like it had been polished. She was 22, working retail in a mall that always felt too bright and too loud. By the time her shift ended, her mind usually felt like a room full of people talking at once. Most nights, she just wanted to get home, take off her shoes, and stop thinking. Tonight, the rain had made that difficult. Not because it was dangerous, it was just a lot. The kind of rain that made you feel trapped in your own plans. The kind that turned simple commutes into long waits and damp sleeves and the quiet irritation of things not going smoothly. Chloe shifted her weight, watching the bus route app spin and refresh. Delayed. She sighed and tucked her phone back into her pocket. She'd been trying lately to get her life to feel more certain, more predictable. She was saving money, applying for different jobs, looking at apartments online she couldn't afford yet, but liked to imagine anyway. She kept telling herself that once she got to the next thing, she'd feel calmer. But the next thing kept moving. And when the rain came down hard earlier, it felt like the universe was just messing with her timing for fun. Chloe leaned her head lightly against the cool glass panel of the shelter. Her hair was slightly damp at the ends. Her sweatshirt smelled faintly like rainwater. She wasn't miserable exactly, just worn down by the feeling that something always had to be managed. A car passed, tires hissing through shallow puddles. Water sprayed out in a thin fan and then settled again. The street accepted it without complaint. Chloe watched that and felt a weird thought slide in. Maybe I'm the only one arguing with what's happening. The rain wasn't personal. It didn't know her. It didn't care about her plans. It was just rain doing rain things, falling where it fell. That thought didn't solve anything, but it softened her irritation just enough. She looked up at the sky. Clouds still covered most of it, but the downpour had slowed into a lighter drizzle. The air felt calmer. The kind of calm that comes not when things are perfect, but when they've already done the worst of what they're going to do. A few people stood nearby under the shelter, quiet strangers with damp bags and tired faces. Nobody was talking much. Everyone had that shared temporary patience that happens when the weather forces you to slow down. Chloe pulled her tote bag closer to her body, feeling the solid weight of it. She wasn't alone, she realized. Not in her discomfort, not in her waiting. Everyone was waiting for something. A bus, a change, a break, a sign. The sky shifted again. A sliver of lighter color appeared at the edge of the clouds. Not bright, not hopeful in a cheesy way. Just different. Chloe took out her phone to check the bus again, then stopped. Not because she didn't care. She did. But she noticed how checking over and over didn't speed anything up. It only made her feel like she was chasing the same moment. She put the phone away and let her shoulders drop. The rain continued quieter now. Drip, 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 Chloe watched the water gather at the curb and flow toward the drain, carrying little pieces of leaf and grit with it. The city looked a little cleaner, not spotless, just washed enough. She thought about fear, not big fear, but that background fear that lived in her chest lately. Fear that she'd make the wrong choice. Fear that she'd be stuck. Fear that she'd miss her chance at something better. Fear loved to show up when the future felt foggy. But the rain had cleared the air in a way she could feel on her skin. Cool, fresh, honest. She lifted her gaze again, and that's when she saw it. Not fully formed yet. Just a faint arc in the distance, barely visible against the thinning clouds. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. A gentle band of color that didn't demand attention. Chloe stared at it, surprised by how much it affected her. It wasn't that she thought it meant something magical. It just reminded her that the sky could change without asking. The rain had looked endless earlier, and now it was already leaving. She stood there, a little straighter still, waiting for the bus, still damp at the edges, but lighter in a way that didn't require explanation. The arc in the sky grew slightly clearer as the drizzle thinned. Chloe didn't take a photo. She didn't want to trap it in her phone. She just watched. Sometimes the beauty doesn't show up instead of the scary part. Sometimes it shows up right after, quietly, like a soft return. The bus arrived without any drama. No screeching brakes, no rush of people. It pulled up slowly, water dripping from its sides, headlights dull in the damp air. Chloe stepped on with the others, tapped her card, and found a seat near the window. The warmth inside fogged the glass, almost immediately softening the outside world into colors and movement. She wiped a small circle in the fog with her sleeve and leaned her head against the window as the bus eased back into traffic. Outside, the rainbow was clearer now. Still gentle. Still not shouting for attention. It stretched across the sky like something the day had almost forgotten to leave behind. Chloe watched it move in and out of view as the bus turned corners and past buildings. It didn't stay perfectly intact. One end faded, then returned. Colors shifted as the angle changed. It was never the same twice. That felt important somehow. Fear, she realized, often came from wanting things to stay fixed. Wanting certainty to hold its shape. Wanting guarantees that didn't really exist. When things shifted plans, moods, directions, fear rushed in to fill the gap. But the rainbow didn't resist changing. It didn't try to stay visible. It appeared softened and slowly thinned out perfectly, okay with not lasting. Chloe's shoulders relaxed as the bus moved steadily forward. The hum of the engine was low and even. People around her sat quietly, some scrolling on their phones, some staring out their own windows. Nobody needed anything from her. That was a relief she hadn't realized she was craving. She thought about how earlier, standing in the rain, everything had felt heavy and inconvenient. How easy it was to believe that discomfort meant something was wrong. But the rain hadn't been a mistake. It had just been weather passing through, doing what it always did. And now something softer followed. Not as a reward, not as compensation, just as the next phase. The bus stopped and started. Traffic lights glowed against the wet street. The rainbow grew fainter, blending back into the gray-blue of the sky until it was hard to tell where it ended and the clouds began. Chloe didn't feel disappointed when it disappeared. She felt settled. She noticed her breath again, slow and even, matching the rhythm of the bus. In that moment, she wasn't behind. She wasn't late. She wasn't failing at anything. She was simply moving, carried forward without needing to control the route. That thought loosened something inside her chest. The future didn't need to look bright all the time to be okay. It didn't need constant signs or reassurance. Sometimes it just needed patience enough to let the storm finish saying what it needed to say. Chloe rested her hands in her lap and watched the city slide past. Storefronts closed for the night. Streetlights flickered on. The ordinary evening unfolded without asking her to understand it. By the time the bus reached her stop, the sky had returned to its usual muted colors. No rainbow, no spectacle, just the quiet aftermath of rain. She stepped off the bus and walked the short distance to her apartment, shoes, damp air cool against her face. The sidewalk glistened, reflecting the lights in broken patterns that shifted with every step. Chloe unlocked her door and went inside, hanging her tote by the entryway. She didn't rush to change clothes. She didn't check her phone. She stood for a moment in the stillness of her apartment, listening to the faint drip of water from the eaves outside. The day had been hard. The rain had been annoying. The waiting had been uncomfortable. And still something gentle had followed. She understood now that fear often showed up when things felt overwhelming. But it didn't get the final word. Change carried its own rhythm. Storms moved through. Clearings appeared. Not always dramatically. Not always on schedule. Sometimes the beauty was brief. Sometimes it was subtle. Sometimes it was only visible if you stopped fighting what came before it. Chloe turned off the lights and went to bed, the memory of the rainbow already fading into something less visual and more felt. A quiet trust. A sense that even after the scariest moments, the world had a way of softening again. The rain had passed. The colors had come and gone. And that was enough to let the night take over gently, without fear. Some evenings don't feel dramatic. Nothing goes wrong in a loud way. It's just that everything feels a little unsteady. Like the ground isn't doing anything wrong, but you don't quite trust it either. It was one of those evenings. A long day had already ended, but the body hadn't caught up yet. The parking lot behind the building was almost empty, the kind of quiet that comes after people have gone home and the lights stay on anyway. The engine was off. The seat was still warm. Somewhere far away, another car started and then faded into the street. Sitting there, there was a familiar feeling in the chest. Not panic, not exactly worry. More like a constant readiness, as if something might happen and it would be important to be prepared. The mind kept drifting forward. Tomorrow's schedule. A conversation that hadn't happened yet. A small fear that didn't have a clear shape. Nothing urgent, but nothing settled either. After a few minutes, the door opened. Cool air came in. Shoes touched the asphalt. The body stretched without thinking about it, shoulders rolling once, twice, as if trying to shake something loose. The night smelled faintly like oil and warm concrete. And then, almost by accident, one foot lifted. It wasn't a decision made with meaning, just a shift of weight while standing beside the car. One foot stayed planted. The other hovered uncertain before settling against the ankle. At first it felt silly. A grown adult standing in a quiet parking lot balanced on one leg like a kid pretending to be a flamingo. But the body didn't care about looking silly. It immediately got busy. Ankles adjusted, toes spread inside the shoe. A small muscle in the calf woke up and complained. There was a wobble. The lifted foot touched down again, then lifted once more. This time the body stayed up, not perfectly still. There was movement, a tiny sway side to side. The arms shifted slightly away from the body without permission, like they knew their job. The breath changed too. Short at first, then slower, deeper, as if it had been waiting for a reason. Standing there on one leg, something became clear in a quiet way. Balance wasn't about being rigid. The moment the body tried to freeze, everything shook more. It was the small, constant adjustments that kept things upright. A little give, a little response. The mind noticed this, and as minds do, tried to turn it into a thought. This is like life. But that thought didn't land very hard. It wasn't needed. Because right then balance wasn't an idea. It was a sensation. The ground felt solid under the standing foot. Cool, reliable. It hadn't changed. The fear that had been sitting in the chest earlier didn't disappear, but it stopped being the center of attention. There was more interesting information coming in now. Pressure, muscle, breath. The lifted leg trembled. That tremble felt important. It would have been easy to judge it, to see it as weakness, as proof that something wasn't strong enough. But the tremble wasn't failing. It was communicating. It was the body saying, "I'm working." After a few seconds, the foot came down again, both feet on the ground. A small exhale followed longer than expected. The shoulders dropped. Nothing had been solved. Tomorrow was still tomorrow. The unknown was still unknown. But something had shifted. The body had learned even briefly that it could stay upright without knowing what came next. That stability didn't require certainty. It only required attention to what was actually happening now. The other foot lifted. This time, balance came a little faster. Not because anything magical had changed, but because the body remembered. It remembered that wobbling wasn't danger. It was part of staying up. A breeze moved through the lot. The overhead lights hummed softly. Somewhere a door closed. Standing there, it became obvious how often balance gets confused with control. As if staying steady means locking everything down. As if fear could be managed by gripping harder. But here gripping did the opposite. Tightening made the wobble worse. Soft knees worked better. A relaxed jaw worked better. Letting the breath move without directing it worked better. The lifted leg shook again, then steadied. And for a moment, there was a quiet understanding that didn't need words. The feeling of being unsure didn't mean something was wrong. It just meant the body was alive, responding, adjusting, staying present with what was real, instead of what might happen. Eventually, the foot came down. Both feet rested on the ground again. The parking lot hadn't changed. The future hadn't explained itself. But standing there, grounded and simple, it felt clear that balance was not something you achieve once and keep forever. It was something you kept meeting moment by moment, especially when things felt unstable. And that was enough for now. Later that night, the body remembered the parking lot. Not as a clear picture, but as a feeling. A subtle memory of weight shifting, of standing without rushing to correct every small movement. It showed up while brushing teeth, while rinsing the mug in the sink, while standing in the dim light of the living room, with nothing particular to do. The mind, meanwhile, kept doing what it always does. It leaned forward. It brought up questions without answers. What if the next step didn't work out? What if something important slipped? What if the balance that felt possible for a moment didn't last? Fear has a way of talking about the future as if it's already real, as if it has evidence, as if it's being helpful. But standing in the quiet room, it was easier to see that fear wasn't actually responding to what was happening. Nothing was wrong in that moment. The floor was still there. The lights were steady. The body was breathing. So without much ceremony, one foot lifted again. This time it wasn't playful. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate but not tense. The standing foot pressed into the floor. The other leg bent slightly at the knee. The body swayed just a little. And there it was, again. That familiar instability. The first instinct was to tighten, to brace, to lock the ankle and hold still. But the memory from earlier interrupted that reflex. Tightening didn't help. It never had. So instead, there was a pause. Not a long pause. Just long enough to notice the urge to control. The body softened where it could. The jaw unclenched. The shoulders dropped half an inch. The breath was allowed to arrive and leave without being shaped. The wobble didn't disappear, but it became workable. Standing on one leg like that made something obvious. The body wasn't asking for guarantees. It wasn't demanding a promise that it wouldn't fall. It was simply asking for presence, for attention to the signals coming in right now instead of imagined outcomes. Fear, on the other hand, kept pointing somewhere else. Later. Soon. What if there was nothing wrong with fear being there? It wasn't an enemy. It was just early. Too early to be useful. The lifted leg trembled again, stronger this time. Muscles fired in quick, quiet patterns. The body adjusted without thinking. A tiny lean forward. A micro shift in the hip. Balance appeared not as stillness, but as constant movement. It was impossible to miss the metaphor, but it didn't need to be explained. The body already understood. Nothing stays fixed. Not balance, not fear, not stability. Trying to freeze any of it only creates strain. After a while, the foot came down. The body rested. The feeling lingered. Later, still lying in bed, the mind tried again. It replayed conversations that hadn't happened yet. It outlined possible problems. It built detailed images of things going wrong, all with the same tone of urgency. But now there was another reference point. Instead of arguing with the thoughts, Attention shifted downward, to the weight of the body on the mattress, to the contact points, to the quiet fact of being supported without effort. Balance didn't require standing on one leg forever. It only required knowing where the ground was. And the ground was here. Fear talked about the future as if it were a place you had already arrived. But the body knew better. The body only ever stood in one moment at a time. One breath, one shift, one adjustment. That night there was no big realization, no dramatic release, just a gradual loosening of the need to solve anything before resting. The next morning would come whether it was prepared for or not. The future would change shape the moment it arrived. It always did. Standing, sitting, lying down. None of these were permanent positions. They were all temporary arrangements, useful for a while, then replaced by the next one. And maybe that was the quiet lesson hidden in the wobble. Stability was not something to secure in advance. It was something that appeared when attention stayed close enough to respond. Eventually sleep came, not because fear had vanished, but because it no longer needed to be managed. It was allowed to exist without being followed. And somewhere in the background, the body remembered how to stand. Not perfectly, not forever, but well enough. Enough to trust the next step when it arrived. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't feel dramatic at all. It doesn't rush in. It doesn't shout. It just sits quietly right at the edge of the next step. That was the feeling that evening. The room was dim lit by a single desk lamp that made a small circle of light and left the rest untouched. Outside, the city had already slowed down. Inside, time felt stretched, like it was waiting for something to happen. The screen was open. The inbox was open too. Nothing new had arrived. No message, no update. Just the same subject lines, the same silence that had been there all day. The kind of silence that invites imagination to fill the space. Hands rested on the desk, fingers still. The body leaned forward slightly as if that might help something appear. The mind kept stepping ahead, rehearsing outcomes that hadn't happened yet. Good ones, bad ones. Mostly bad ones because fear is efficient that way. It felt like standing at the edge of something unseen, not a visible cliff, more like an absence. The future didn't look dangerous. It just didn't look like anything at all. And that somehow was worse. The urge was to wait. To stay exactly where things were known, even if they weren't comfortable. Waiting felt safer than stepping into uncertainty without proof that something solid would meet the foot on the other side. The chair creaked softly as weight shifted. The lamp hummed faintly. The room offered small, ordinary sounds that suggested stability, but the mind wasn't interested in those. It was focused on the gap. What if there was nothing there? What if this step was a mistake? What if moving forward made things worse? These questions didn't ask to be answered. They asked to be obeyed. After a while, the body noticed something else. The shoulders had crept upward. The jaw was tight. The breath was shallow, hovering near the top of the chest, like it didn't want to commit to being fully taken. There was a pause, not a decision. Just a pause long enough to feel how uncomfortable standing still had become. The idea appeared quietly. Just one small step. Not a leap, not a commitment, not a final choice. Just a step small enough that it couldn't ruin anything. The hand moved to the mouse. The cursor hovered. Then instead of refreshing the inbox again, the screen was minimized. The room felt different immediately. Not better, just different. The light from the lamp fell onto the desk instead of the screen. The edges of the room came back into awareness. The body leaned back in the chair. It was strange how small that action was and how much resistance it had carried. Fear hadn't been about the email. It had been about the idea that movement required certainty. Standing up from the chair, the floor met the feet without ceremony. The body stood there for a moment, unsure what came next. The gap hadn't disappeared. It was still there, invisible and wide, but now something else was present too. Momentum. The step hadn't revealed a bridge. It hadn't solved the future. It had only shown that the ground under the feet was still reliable. Walking to the window, the glass reflected a faint outline of the room. Lights from other apartments dotted the darkness. Other lives were unfolding, each with their own gaps, their own unanswered questions. No one else seemed to have it figured out either. The thought didn't bring comfort, but it brought honesty. The fear softened slightly, not because it had been argued with, but because it was no longer in charge. The body had moved anyway. Returning to the desk, the chair welcomed weight again. The screen stayed minimized. For the first time all evening, there was no urge to check. The step had already been taken. The gap was still invisible, but it felt less threatening now. Maybe bridges don't appear in advance. Maybe they form underfoot, one small decision at a time, not as a structure you can see from afar, but as something you discover only after you've already moved. The body settled into the chair. The breath deepened slightly. The night continued. Nothing had been resolved, but something had begun. And for now, that was enough. Later that night, the gap showed up again. Not at the desk this time, but in quieter places. In the pause before turning off the light. In the moment between setting the phone down and actually letting the hand relax. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It just lingered like a question left open on purpose. The body noticed it before the mind did. A slight tightness in the stomach. A familiar pull forward toward tomorrow. Toward outcomes that hadn't arrived yet and didn't know their own shape. Fear has a strange way of pretending to be practical. It says it's just being careful, just planning ahead, just trying to prevent regret. But standing there in the dim room, it was easier to see what fear was really asking for. It wasn't asking for safety. It was asking for certainty. And certainty wasn't available. The floor lamp cast a soft glow across the wall. Shadows shifted slightly as the air moved. Everything in the room existed without needing to know what came next. The body lowered onto the couch. The cushion adjusted. Support appeared without negotiation. That felt important. The gap in the mind was loudest when attention stayed in the future. When it imagined the step after the next step, and then the one after that. When it tried to see the whole bridge before even leaving the edge. But when attention returned to what was here, the weight of the body, the texture of the fabrics, quiet hum of the building, the gap lost some of its power. It was still there, but it wasn't in control. It became clear that fear didn't actually mind small steps. It panicked at the idea of irreversible ones. It feared commitment more than movement. So movement stayed small. The phone was placed face down on the table. Not hidden, not turned off, just not centered. The room seemed to exhale at the same time the body did. Another step. The breath deepened, not intentionally, but because it finally had room to. The shoulders softened, the jaw unclenched. Nothing dramatic happened, and that too felt important. Fear often expects catastrophe or relief, something big enough to justify its presence. But here, there was neither, just continuation. The mind tried again later while lying in bed. It brought up alternate futures. It tested scenarios. It asked the same question in different forms. Is this the right path? The question didn't need an answer tonight. There was a realization, quiet and almost easy to miss. The gap didn't exist because something was missing. It existed because something hadn't been defined yet, and not everything needed to be. Uncertainty wasn't a flaw in the process. It was part of it. Bridges, it turned out, weren't always structures you could see. Sometimes they were patterns of response, a willingness to adjust, a trust that the next support would appear only when it was needed. The body rolled onto its side. The mattress shifted. The room stayed still. Fear softened again, not because it had been convinced, but because it had been outpaced. Action, even gentle action, had moved faster than imagination. There was no guarantee that the next step would be easy, no promise that it wouldn't require effort or courage. But there was a growing sense that standing frozen at the edge was no longer the safest option. The body had already learned something essential, that it could move without knowing, that it could step without seeing. That support often revealed itself only after weight had been placed on it. Sleep arrived gradually without announcement. The gap didn't close. It simply stopped demanding attention. And in that quiet, it felt possible to trust that when morning came, the next step would be there to take. Not because the future had been solved, but because the present had proven itself steady enough to stand on. For now, that was all that was needed. They sit on a metal bench at the edge of a quiet bus station, long after the last announcement has echoed and faded into the ceiling. The place smells faintly of old coffee and rain carried in on jackets. Their shoulders ache in a dull, familiar way. The kind of ache that doesn't surprise them anymore. Because it has been there for so long, it almost feels like part of their posture. The backpack rests on the floor between their feet. It's not large, not obviously overstuffed, but the straps cut into their shoulders as if it carries more than clothes and a phone charger. When they lean forward and lift it slightly, even for a moment, The weight pulls down with quiet insistence, reminding them that everything they've been carrying is still there. They tell themselves this is normal. Everyone who travels long enough learns to live with weight. You adjust. You tighten the straps. You keep going. A bus pulls in somewhere down the platform, its brakes hissing softly, but it isn't theirs. They check the screen anyway, even though they already know the departure time hasn't changed. The waiting gives their mind too much room to wander, and it does exactly what it always does when there's nothing urgent to distract it. It starts listing things that should have gone differently. Conversations replayed with sharper words. Decisions reviewed like receipts pulled from a pocket and smoothed out again and again, as if something new might appear on the paper. They imagine future problems too, lining them up neatly, just in case they forget to worry about them later. They shift on the bench, feeling the cold seep through the metal. The backpack leans against their shin now, steady and solid, like proof that they are prepared. That's what they've always believed anyway. If you carry enough, you won't be caught off guard. If you think far enough ahead, nothing will surprise you too badly. They unzip the top pocket to look for their headphones, and the sound of the zipper is louder than expected in the quiet station. Inside, things are packed carefully, each item placed with intention. A folded jacket, a notebook with half-filled pages, a book they keep meaning to finish, receipts they don't need but haven't thrown away yet. They pause, fingers resting on the edge of the open pocket, noticing how full it feels, despite not holding anything essential. For a moment, they just sit there, breathing, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside, and the occasional cough or footstep from someone else waiting. They think about how far they still want to go. Not just tonight, but in general. How many miles they imagine are still ahead of them, and how tired they already feel, even before standing up. Without fully deciding to, they pull the backpack onto their lap and open the main compartment. The fabric makes a soft, tired sound, like it's been opened and closed too many times before. They take things out slowly, setting them beside them on the bench. The extra pair of shoes they packed just in case. A stack of papers they've been carrying from place to place without reading again. A small object they once kept for comfort, even though they can't remember the last time it actually helped. Each item makes a quiet thud as it touches the metal bench. The backpack grows lighter with every movement, though they don't notice it right away. What they notice instead is the hesitation that comes before putting anything down for good. What if they need it later? What if letting go now means being unprepared later? The thoughts rise quickly, almost automatically, like they've been trained to appear. They don't feel dramatic or emotional. They feel practical, responsible, sensible. They hold one item in their hands for a long moment, turning it over, feeling its familiar shape. It represents something they've been holding on to for a long time. Something that once made sense to keep. Back when the road felt less predictable. Back when they believed carrying more would make the journey easier. They place it back in the bag, then pause, then take it out again. This time they don't rush. They notice the tension in their jaw, the way their shoulders are slightly raised, even though they're sitting still. They notice how their breathing has been shallow, like their body expects to have to move at any second. Slowly, they set the item down on the bench beside them. Not with drama, not with relief, just with a quiet decision. It stays there unmoving, and nothing bad happens. They let out a breath they didn't realize they were holding. The backpack doesn't look much different, but when they lift it again, the weight has changed. It doesn't pull as hard. The straps feel less sharp against their palms. The difference is subtle, but it's there. They sit back and rest their hands on their thighs, eyes unfocused, letting the moment settle. The station remains the same. The night doesn't shift. The future doesn't suddenly become clear or easy. But something small has loosened. They realize that for a long time, they haven't been asking whether what they carry is still useful. They've only been asking whether it might be needed someday. And that question alone has been enough to keep everything with them mile after mile. The departure board flickers softly overhead. Somewhere a bus door closes. Time continues indifferent and steady, whether they are ready or not. They look down at the items, still resting on the bench beside them. And for the first time, they don't feel the urge to pick them all back up. They don't put everything back into the backpack right away. For a while, they just let the items sit there beside them as if they belong to someone else now. The bench feels less crowded, and so does their body. Their knees are free, their shoulders have dropped a little, and the air around them seems to move more easily. It's strange how quickly the mind wants to step in and explain what just happened. It starts offering reasons, turning a simple moment into a story with meaning and lessons. But they don't follow it this time. They stay with the physical sensation instead, with the way their hands feel warmer now, with the way their breathing has slowed without being told to. They slip the backpack onto one shoulder, then the other. The straps settle without biting into the skin. It still has weight, still feels real, but it no longer demands their full attention. They roll their shoulders once, twice, noticing how the movement feels different than before. As they stand up, the station seems a little larger, or maybe it's just that they're taking it in without rushing. The fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. A janitor pushes a cart down the platform wheels, squeaking in a slow, patient rhythm. Somewhere a phone vibrates briefly, and then goes quiet again. They take a few steps, then stop, turning back to the bench. The items are still there exactly where they left them. No one has touched them. No one seems interested. The world hasn't noticed their small act of leaving something behind. That feels important, though they can't quite say why. For so long they've believed that if they don't hold on to everything, something will be lost forever. That memories will fade. That mistakes will repeat themselves. That they'll be caught unprepared when the road bends in an unexpected way. But standing there now, they realize that what they left behind wasn't a memory or a lesson. It was the weight of constantly revisiting it, of carrying it forward, even when it no longer changed anything. They walk toward the platform where their bus will arrive, their footsteps quieter than before. With each step, their mind tries to reach back, to check the past one more time, to scan the future for danger. The habit is still there. It hasn't disappeared. What has changed is how quickly they notice it. When a familiar worry surfaces, They don't argue with it. They don't try to replace it with a better thought. They simply see it like they saw the items on the bench and keep walking. The worry follows for a moment, then falls behind, unable to keep pace. They think about how often they've treated their thoughts like supplies, convinced that every concern might be useful later, that every fear might prevent a mistake. They've packed their mind the same way they packed their bag, filling every empty space until nothing could shift or breathe. But now, with a little room left inside, things move differently. A breeze slips through the station, cool and brief, lifting the edge of their jacket. It doesn't stay, but it doesn't need to. They feel it pass through and go, and something about that feels right. The bus arrives quietly, less dramatic than they expected. Doors open with a soft sigh. A small line forms, people stepping forward with tickets in hand, eyes half-lidded, each carrying their own version of weight. They join the line, not rushing, not checking their phone for the 5th time. The floor vibrates faintly beneath their shoes as the engine idles. The sound is steady, reliable, like a low hum that doesn't ask for attention. As they step onto the bus, they notice how easy it is to lift the backpack into the overhead rack. The movement surprises them. It's not effortless, but it's manageable, and that feels like enough. They take a seat by the window. The glass is cool against their temple as they lean their heads slightly to the side. Outside, the lights blur and stretch, turning the station into a soft pattern of motion and color. Their mind reaches out again, out of habit, searching for something to hold on to. A problem to solve. A plan to rehearse. Finding nothing urgent, it hesitates. In that pause, there is a quiet they don't often allow themselves to feel. Not the quiet of everything being perfect or resolved, but the quiet of not stirring the water just to see what will happen. They don't tell themselves to stop thinking. They don't promise to travel lighter from now on. They don't make a rule out of this moment. They simply sit, feeling the bus begin to move, feeling the road carry them forward, noticing how much easier it is to travel when they're no longer rearranging the weight in their mind every few seconds. The night stretches ahead, open and undecorated. And for once, that doesn't feel like something they need to fix. He stops on the bridge without meaning to. It isn't a scenic bridge, just a narrow wooden one tucked into a quiet city park that most people pass through without looking down. At this hour, the lamps along the path glow softly, not bright enough to wake anyone, just bright enough to remind the night where the edges are. The river moves beneath him with a steady, unhurried sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. He rests his forearms on the railing and looks down, watching the water slide past the posts and stones without pausing. The surface catches pieces of light and lets them go again, carrying reflections away before they can settle. He tells himself he's only stopping for a moment. His walk was supposed to be short, just enough to loosen the stiffness from sitting too long during the day. But something about the sound of the water pulls him into stillness, the way a familiar song can stop you mid-step. His phone vibrates in his pocket. A notification. Maybe a message. Maybe nothing important. He doesn't check it. For once, the thought of opening another conversation, even a harmless one, feels heavier than standing here in the cool air. The river doesn't care that he's watching it. That thought arrives quietly, without judgment. The water doesn't slow down. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't look back to see what it just passed. He envies that more than he expects to. Lately, his mind has been busy with old scenes, moments that replay themselves without asking permission. Things he said too quickly. Things he didn't say at all. Choices that felt small at the time but seem enormous now when viewed from a distance. During the day, he manages well enough. He stays productive. He answers emails. He finishes what needs to be finished. But at night, when the noise thins out, the past steps closer, like it's been waiting patiently for its turn. He watches a leaf drift into view, caught in a slow swirl near the edge of the bank. For a second, it spins in place, circling the same patch of water before the current pulls it free and carries it on. His chest tightens slightly. That's how it feels, he thinks. Like circling the same memory, the same regret, convinced that if he looks at it from one more angle, something will finally change. He presses his palms against the railing, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his skin. It's rough in places, smooth in others, worn down by years of hands, doing exactly what he's doing now. He wonders how many people have stood here before him, leaning forward, lost in their own thoughts, each one believing their worries are uniquely heavy. The river keeps moving. He remembers a time when he believed that thinking harder was the same as fixing something. That if he could just understand the past well enough, replay it clearly enough, he could somehow reach back and adjust the outcome. But standing here now, watching the water pass under his feet, the idea feels thin, almost strange. He imagines trying to stop the river with his hands, scooping water backward, forcing it upstream. The image is almost ridiculous. No matter how much effort he puts in the water, would slide through his fingers unchanged by his struggle. A car passes somewhere nearby, tires whispering against wet pavement. The sound fades quickly, leaving the river alone again in the quiet. His breathing slows to match the rhythm below him. In, out. The water doesn't rush. It doesn't hesitate. A memory surfaces uninvited, one he knows well. His shoulders tense automatically, preparing to follow it down the familiar path of self-criticism and replay. This time, though, something interrupts the pattern. He looks back down at the river. The memory is still there, but now it feels less solid, like a reflection instead of a thing he can touch. It flickers, then shifts, distorted by movement. He doesn't push it away. He doesn't tell himself to stop thinking about it. He simply lets it sit where it is, without stepping fully into it. The moment stretches gentle and unforced. He realizes that the river isn't teaching him anything new. It isn't offering advice or comfort. It's simply showing him what it has been doing all along. Moving forward, without checking behind itself. He straightens slightly, rolling his shoulders back, feeling the tension ease just a little. The night air feels cooler, now cleaner. The past is still there. He knows that. It hasn't disappeared. But standing here, listening to the water slip away beneath him, he understands something in his body that his mind has resisted for a long time. Nothing down there is waiting for him to pull it back. He stays on the bridge longer than he planned to, not because he's trying to understand anything, but because leaving feels unnecessary right now. The river continues its steady movement beneath him, unchanged by his attention, and that consistency becomes oddly comforting. For years he's treated his thoughts like responsibilities. Something to manage, something to review carefully so nothing important slips through unnoticed. Letting the past replay itself has felt productive even when it left him exhausted. At least he was doing something with it. Standing here, he begins to sense how much effort that has taken. Another memory rises, this one quieter, less sharp. It floats into awareness and then drifts, pulled along by the same current as the leaf before it. He watches it without following. The urge to step inside it appears for a moment, then fades when he doesn't feed it. He notices the space that remains. It isn't empty in a dramatic way. It's simply unoccupied. Like a chair no one is sitting in, or a room after someone has left, and close the door gently behind them. His phone vibrates again. This time he takes it out, glances at the screen and slides it back into his pocket without opening anything. The world doesn't react. Nothing collapses. The river doesn't slow. He smiles faintly at that. A breeze moves across the bridge, brushing his face and lifting the hair at the back of his neck. It's cool, but not cold. The kind of air that reminds you you're awake without asking you to do anything about it. He steps back from the railing and begins to walk his pace unhurried. Each footstep sounds clearer, now the wood responding with a soft, hollow knock beneath his shoes. The path curves away from the river, and after a few steps, he can no longer see the water directly, but he can still hear it. The sound follows him for a while, faint but present, like a reminder that movement doesn't stop just because he's no longer watching. That feels important too. As he walks, his mind reaches backward again out of habit. It checks for unfinished thoughts, unresolved scenes, moments that might need another look. When it finds them, they feel lighter than before, as if they've already begun to loosen. He doesn't push them away. He lets them walk alongside him for a few steps, then notices when they drift off. Attention caught by something else. A streetlight flickering. A cat darting across the path. The quiet rhythm of his own breathing. He realizes that overthinking hasn't disappeared. It's still there, ready to return whenever there's space for it. But it no longer feels like something he has to wrestle with. It feels more like a current he can choose not to swim against. There's a difference between remembering and living inside memory. He hasn't always known that. For a long time, he believed that if he stopped revisiting the past, it meant he didn't care enough. Now, walking away from the bridge, he understands that caring doesn't require constant return. The river has already taken those moments downstream. They exist, but they are no longer where he is standing. By the time he reaches the end of the path, the sounds of the city grow a little louder. A distant siren, a door closing, life continuing in its ordinary, unspectacular way. He pauses once more, not to look back, but to notice how his body feels. His chest is less tight. His jaw isn't clenched. His thoughts move more slowly, like they're no longer in a hurry to catch something before it gets away. The future doesn't feel clearer. He still doesn't have answers to everything he's been carrying. But the need to resolve it all right now has softened. He turns onto the sidewalk and continues home, steps, steady hands relaxed at his sides. Somewhere behind him, the river keeps moving, passing under bridges, around stones, through places no one will ever stop to watch. It doesn't remember where it has been, and it doesn't worry about where it's going next. It simply goes. And tonight, for the first time in a long while, he lets that be enough. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.